I never thought I'd be the last guy left at a Pride Parade cleanup, much less chatting with the one person I'd been trying to talk to all day. It sounds like the start of a cheesy rom-com, right? But here I was, standing ankle-deep in confetti and discarded rainbow flags, the sun finally dipping behind the city skyline, and my heart pounding like I'd just run a marathon, or at least a very awkward 5K. So, let me back up a bit. The parade was wild. Rainbows everywhere, music blasting, people dancing and celebrating like there was no tomorrow. I'd spent the day with my friends, mostly just blending into the colorful chaos, but my eyes kept drifting to this one guy. You know that kind of magnetism you can't explain? Yeah, it was that. He had this effortless vibe, like he belonged on a stage, or at least the center of every cool conversation. I didn't even know his name. I was pacing near the barricades, trying not to look like I was stalking him, when I saw him linger near a pile of empty water bottles. He looked a little tired, like he'd been on his feet for hours, but there was this grin on his face that made me think he was having the time of his life. Eventually, he started picking up trash, rolling up discarded streamers with a patience that surprised me. Somehow, I ended up helping him. We didn't say much at first, mostly just small talk about how brutal it was to clean up after thousands of people. But as the crowds thinned and most of the volunteers left, it became clear we were the only two left. The sky turned a soft purple as the city lights flickered on, and suddenly, the mess around us didn't feel so overwhelming. Instead, it was like we had our own little world, just the two of us surrounded by this mess we were making sense of together. I finally worked up the nerve to ask his name. He smiled, and it was like the whole day's nervous energy just melted away. "Eli," he said, holding out his hand. I'm still not sure how a day that started with me avoiding eye contact with strangers ended with me standing in a pile of glitter, talking to Eli like we'd known each other for years. But something about that moment made me think, maybe this was exactly where I was supposed to be. And just when I was about to ask if he wanted to grab a coffee or something, a stray dog ran by, scattering the last few balloons, and the moment slipped away like it was never really there. But I'm not letting it go that easily. Because sometimes, the messiest, most unexpected endings make the best stories. And this one? It's just getting started. I blinked, watching the dog dart between the legs of a couple of stragglers still hauling bags of trash. It was just a quick interruption, but it felt like the universe was teasing me, like it had thrown a curveball when I was finally about to throw my pitch. Eli chuckled and shook his head, as if he'd noticed the same thing. "So dog just crashed our private party?" he joked, crouching to pick up a glitter-coated piece of confetti stuck to his shoe. "Yeah, definitely not part of the plan," I said, grinning. I wanted to say something smooth, something that didn't sound like I'd just been rehearsing in my head for days, but the words tangled up. Instead, I just nodded toward the street. "You thinking what I'm thinking? We could get out of here, grab a drink or something." Eli hesitated for a beat that felt like forever, but then his eyes lit up with that same easy warmth I'd noticed earlier in the day. "I was just wondering if you'd ask." We left the trash bags and confetti piles behind, stepping out of the fading purple shadows and into the neon glow of a nearby bar. The place was packed with a mix of post-parade revelers nursing their drinks and casual Friday night crowds. We snagged a small table tucked into a corner, the noise buzzing around us but somehow not drowning out the connection that was starting to build. "What's your story?" Eli asked after a sip of his drink, the kind of casual question that somehow felt loaded. I shrugged, trying to find the right words without sounding like I was auditioning for a memoir. "Honestly, I'm just a guy who wandered into the parade hoping to feel some kind of spark. And weirdly, I think I found it, but not where I expected." He smiled, eyes twinkling. "That's pretty poetic for a guy who was supposed to be packing up trash." "Hey, the trash part was mandatory," I said, laughing. "But you? You looked like you were born to be out there, in the middle of all the chaos and color." Eli's smile softened. "I've been coming to Pride every year since I was a kid. It's like my safe place, my reminder that I'm not alone. I guess I've always looked for moments where I can just be myself without worrying about what anyone thinks. Today was a good day." There was something in his voice, a quiet honesty, that made me want to lean in closer, to hear more, and maybe to share a little of my own story. "I get that," I said. "I've been out for a while, but sometimes it still feels like I'm hiding in plain sight." Like I want to shout it from the rooftops, but then something stops me. Eli nodded knowingly. It's scary, isn't it? But moments like today remind me why it's worth it. Why we keep showing up, even when it's hard. For a while, we just sat there, the noise fading into the background as we talked about everything and nothing, our favorite music, terrible date stories, the weird quirks that made us who we are. At one point, Eli glanced at his watch and frowned. Wow, I didn't realize it was this late. Guess we really did miss the crowd. I looked around the bar, noticing how the energy had shifted from loud celebration to a more mellow, intimate vibe. Yeah, feels like we carved out our own little world tonight, he smiled, leaning back in his chair. I'm glad I got to share it with someone who gets it. That hit me harder than I expected. Because it's one thing to be seen by a crowd, but it's another to be seen by someone who actually understands. Before I could say anything else, my phone buzzed. A text from my friends. Where are you? We're heading to the after party. I hesitated, glancing back at Eli. They want to know where I am. He shrugged, like it was no big deal. You should go, but if you want, I'd like to see you again. Maybe somewhere less chaotic? I felt a flutter in my chest. Yeah, I'd like that. We exchanged numbers, that small, modern ritual that somehow felt like the beginning of something real. Then, with a final smile and a promise to text soon, we parted ways. Walking back to meet my friends, I couldn't stop grinning. The parade was over, the crowds were gone, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something I'd never seen coming. And honestly, I couldn't wait to see where it went from there. I rejoined my friends, who were already buzzing with post-parade energy, their faces still glowing from the day's excitement. They peppered me with questions. Where have you been? Did you see the drag queen toss the giant glitter bomb? But I was only half listening. My mind was still tangled in the moment with Eli, replaying our conversation, the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, how his voice had this calm steadiness that made me feel like everything else could wait. That night, I texted him almost immediately. I know, classic move, maybe a little desperate, but honestly, I wasn't trying to play it cool. I told him I had a great time and asked if he wanted to meet up the next day. When my phone buzzed back before I even finished typing, my stomach did that weird flip-flop feeling. Absolutely. Let's grab coffee. The next afternoon, I found myself nervously waiting outside a little cafe not far from the park. The weather was perfect. Sunny, but with a cool breeze that hinted summer was coming to a close. I arrived early, pacing a little, trying to figure out how to act like I wasn't about to meet someone who had already made my week. Then Eli showed up, casually cool in a vintage jacket, and a smile that instantly melted my nerves. He waved, and I couldn't help but wave back like an idiot. We ordered coffee, black for him, some weird oat milk latte for me, and snagged a small table by the window. The city buzzed around us, but it felt like we were in this bubble where time slowed down just enough for us to really talk. So, Eli said, stirring his coffee, "What's your life story, Mr. Trash Picker?" I laughed, shaking my head. "Hey, don't make me relive the glory of last night," he grinned. "Fair enough. But seriously, tell me something no one else knows." I hesitated, then decided to roll the dice. I'm terrible at first dates. Like, I can't stop overthinking every word. And I'm always worried I'm boring. Eli's smile softened. Funny. I was thinking the same thing. But here we are, so maybe we're both just lucky. For a while, we traded little stories, the kind that don't sound like much, but somehow say everything. The terrible jobs we had in college, the music that defined our awkward teenage years, the awkward crushes that never went anywhere. With each confession, the space between us shrank, replaced by this quiet understanding. At one point, Eli looked out the window and then back at me. You know, I spend a lot of time thinking about what being yourself really means. I mean, it sounds so cliche, but it's complicated. I nodded. Yeah, like, you want to be authentic, but sometimes you're scared that the real you isn't enough. He smiled wistfully. Exactly. But then days like yesterday remind me that there's strength in just showing up, no matter how messy or imperfect things are. His words hit me harder than I expected, because there I was, sitting across from someone who not only understood but shared that same vulnerability. The afternoon slipped away faster than I wanted. When we finally stood to leave, Eli surprised me by slipping his hand into mine. The gesture was simple, but it sent a rush straight to my chest. "Want to take a walk?" he asked. I didn't hesitate. We wandered through the park, the golden light of late afternoon casting long shadows. We talked about dreams, some serious, some ridiculous, and I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't in a long time. It wasn't just the words. It was the way he listened, like my thoughts mattered more than anything else. At one point, we stopped by a fountain, the water sparkling in the sun. Eli looked at me, eyes searching. "I'm glad we ran into each other during the cleanup. It felt like fate or something." I laughed, feeling a mix of nerves and happiness. "Yeah, fate and a stray dog. Can't forget the dog." He squeezed my hand. The dog was a hero. That night, as I lay in bed replaying every moment, I realized something. Sometimes, the best connections come from the most unexpected places. The quiet moments after the noise fades, the scraps of conversation over coffee, the shared smiles in a pile of confetti. I didn't know where this was going yet. Hell, maybe it wouldn't last forever, but for the first time in a while, I was excited to find out. Because with Eli, even the messiest parts felt worth it. The days that followed felt like I was walking on this strange, exciting tightrope, trying to balance between the thrill of something new and the usual self-doubt that creeps in when you're not totally sure where you stand. Eli and I kept texting, but it wasn't that just checking in small talk. We talked about everything. The weird snacks we liked, our favorite terrible movies. That one time I accidentally set off a fire alarm at work. Don't ask. One evening, a couple of days after our coffee date, Eli invited me over to his place for dinner. I was equal parts nervous and thrilled, wondering what it would be like to see him in his own space, outside the carefully curated moments of the parade or the cafe. His apartment was exactly how I imagined. Bright, warm, with little touches everywhere that felt so him. A shelf full of books, some art prints he'd done himself, and in the corner, a tiny potted plant that looked like it had been through a few rough patches but was still standing strong. He greeted me with that same easy smile, and just like that, the nervous energy melted. We cooked together. Well, Eli mostly cooked, and I played sous chef and taste tester. It was ridiculous and fun, all clumsy knife chops and laughter echoing through the kitchen. At one point, I caught him watching me with this soft look that made my stomach flip again. "You're impossible to read," I teased, trying to sound casual but failing spectacularly. He laughed. "Maybe I'm just waiting for you to screw up so I can tease you back." I smiled, feeling like I could stay in that moment forever. Later, we settled on the couch, plates half empty, and the city lights casting a lazy glow through the window. For a while, we just sat there, letting the silence stretch comfortably between us. Then Eli shifted, turning toward me. "Can I be honest?" "Please do," I said, heart thumping. "I'm scared," he said quietly. "Not because of what people might think, but because I haven't felt this connected in a long time. And it's terrifying to feel like maybe someone gets you, and then you have to figure out what that means." I nodded, because damn if I didn't feel the same way. "Yeah, it's weird being vulnerable, especially when you want it so badly but don't want to get hurt." He reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair from my forehead, and for a second, the whole world seemed to hold its breath. "Maybe we don't have to figure it all out right now," he said softly. "Maybe we can just be here. Messy, complicated, and kind of perfect." I smiled, feeling tears prick the back of my eyes. Not because I was sad, but because I realized how rare and beautiful that kind of honesty was. We spent the rest of the night talking about what we wanted from life, and from each other. Not the grand, sweeping plans, but the little things. Quiet mornings with bad coffee, random adventures on weekends, the freedom to be exactly who we were. Over the next few weeks, we fell into a rhythm that felt natural. Our days weren't perfect. There were misunderstandings and moments where doubts crept in, but there was always this thread of genuine care pulling us back together. One afternoon, we found ourselves back at the park where we'd walked after our coffee date. It was a bit chillier now, early fall creeping in, leaves turning shades of amber and crimson. We sat on a bench, wrapped in scarves, watching kids chase each other and couples stroll by. Eli leaned his head on my shoulder, and I felt this quiet sense of peace settle over me. "You know," he said, voice low, "I never thought cleaning up after a parade could lead to this." I laughed. "Yeah, me neither, but I'm glad it did." He looked up at me, eyes shining. "Me too." In that moment, surrounded by the soft rustling of leaves and the hum of city life, I realized something important. Sometimes the best stories start when you think the party's over, when the crowd has gone home and all that's left is the mess. Because in that mess, you find the real stuff, the connections, the chances, the unexpected beginnings. And with Eli, I wasn't just cleaning up after a parade. I was starting something that felt like it could last. As the weeks rolled on, Eli and I settled into something that felt both familiar and new, like slipping into a favorite song you hadn't heard in years, but never forgot. We weren't rushing anything. No pressure, no grand declarations, just a slow, steady unfolding of moments that stitched us closer together. One evening, maybe 3 weeks in, Eli invited me over again. This time, it wasn't about cooking dinner or grabbing coffee. It was more spontaneous, a text that just said, "Come hang out. I have something to show you." I showed up, a little curious, a little excited, and found him waiting at his door with that same warm smile and a mischievous glint in his eyes. "Okay, what's the secret?" I asked as I stepped inside. He motioned for me to follow him into the living room where a low light glowed, and on the coffee table sat a dusty old box. He rummaged around for a moment and pulled out a worn photo album. "This," Eli said, "is my personal treasure chest." We sat side by side on the couch, and he started flipping through the pages. Pictures of him as a kid, awkward teenage years, snapshots from other pride parades, candid shots of friends and family. Each image told a story, and with everyone, Eli shared a piece of himself I hadn't known, the victories and the scars, the laughter and the tough days. I found myself opening up in return, telling him about my family holidays that never quite felt right, my own journey figuring out who I was, the times I'd felt invisible even in a room full of people. It was a slow, raw exchange. No filters, no masks. Just two guys sharing the parts of their lives they didn't show the world. At one point, Eli looked at me and said, "I don't think I've ever felt this safe. Like I can just be me without worrying." I nodded. "Yeah, it's crazy how rare that feeling is." We ended up lying on the floor, side by side, staring up at the ceiling, letting the silence speak for a while. Eventually, I turned to him, heart pounding. "You know, I'm really glad we're doing this, whatever it is." He smiled softly. "Me too." There was a pause, that perfect kind of quiet, where you sense something just on the edge. Then he shifted closer, and without any grand fanfare, our lips met. It was gentle, a question more than a statement, but it sparked something inside me. The days of awkward glances and missed chances felt miles away. This was real. Afterward, we stayed wrapped up in each other's arms, and I realized how much I'd wanted this without knowing it. Someone who saw me, really saw me, and still chose to stay. But as much as I wanted to freeze that moment, life didn't stop. There were days when work got hectic, when old insecurities bubbled up, when the world outside wasn't always as kind or understanding as the bubble Eli and I were building together. One afternoon, we had a disagreement. Something small, really, but it felt bigger in the moment. Words got tangled, feelings got hurt, and for the first time since we'd met, there was this uncomfortable distance between us. I spent the night tossing and turning, going over what I could have said differently, how I could fix it. But the next day, Eli surprised me. He showed up at my door, holding 2 coffees, one of them with a little doodle of a rainbow on the lid. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "I don't want to let the hard stuff get in the way." I smiled, feeling a weight lift off my chest. "Me neither." We sat down, talked it out, the awkward parts, the misunderstandings, the fears, and somehow the cracks just made what we had feel stronger. It was in those moments, messy, imperfect, real, that I realized love wasn't just the butterflies and the easy laughs. It was the willingness to stay through the tough days, to keep showing up even when it's hard. And with Eli, I wanted to keep showing up. Because sometimes, the best parts of a story aren't the perfect scenes. They're the ones where you find someone who's willing to stick around when the confetti settles, when the streets are empty, and all that's left is the two of you, figuring it out together. After that rough patch, things settled into a rhythm that felt less like a fairy tale and more like real life, which honestly was a relief. Eli and I started carving out little traditions, small rituals that made this whole thing feel more ours. Like Sunday mornings when we'd both attempt to make pancakes, often ending in flour fights and burnt edges, but somehow always tasting better than they had any right to. Or those late night walks where we'd wander the quiet streets, talking about everything from politics to the dumbest memes we'd seen that day. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after we met, Eli surprised me with tickets to a small art exhibit downtown. I'd mentioned once or twice that I liked galleries but never got around to going, so when he handed me the little envelope, I was genuinely touched. The gallery was tucked away in an old brick building, full of these intimate, moody spaces that made you feel like you'd stumbled into someone else's secret world. Eli was in his element, explaining the pieces with a kind of passion that made me see things through his eyes. "You see that one?" he said, pointing to a painting that looked like a swirl of colors with no obvious shape. At first, it's messy chaos, but if you take a step back, it's this beautiful explosion. Kinda like life, huh? I nodded, suddenly aware of how perfectly that description fit us. We moved room to room, our hands brushing occasionally until Eli finally took mine, squeezing gently. After the exhibit, we grabbed coffee at a nearby cafe, still buzzing from the art and each other's company. "Thanks for dragging me out tonight," I said. "I needed this." He smiled. "Yeah? Me too. It's nice seeing the world through your eyes sometimes." That struck me, because while I'd been the guy who was tentative, unsure, and maybe a little guarded, Eli had this way of making me feel like being myself was enough. Over the next month, our connection deepened in ways neither of us expected. We met each other's friends, navigated family introductions, and slowly started blending our lives together. It wasn't all smooth sailing. There were moments when old wounds bubbled up, or when the world outside felt heavy and unkind, but we faced those days hand in hand. One chilly evening, Eli invited me to his place for dinner again, this time with a twist. The apartment was dimly lit with candles, and soft music played in the background. He had this nervous energy about him I hadn't seen before. "Okay, so this might be cheesy," he said, cheeks flushing slightly, "but I've been working on something." He pulled out a small sketchbook and flipped to a page where he'd drawn a cartoon version of us. 2 stick figures, one holding a trash picker and the other with a coffee cup. Above it, he'd scrawled, "The Messy Beginning." I laughed, the sound genuine and warm. "This is incredible, and honestly, kind of perfect." He looked at me, eyes serious now. "I don't want this to be just a moment. I want this to be us. Whatever that means." I felt something shift deep inside me, a mix of hope and fear and excitement. "I want that too," I said, reaching across the table to take his hand. We stayed like that for a while, words unnecessary, because we both knew that the messy, imperfect journey we'd started was something rare and worth holding on to. But as much as I wanted to believe in forever, life had its own plans. A couple of days later, I got a call from work, something about a project that would require me to relocate for a few months. It wasn't permanent, just temporary, but enough to throw everything into question. I didn't know how to tell Eli. I stalled, hoping maybe it would go away or that I'd figure out a way to make it work without hurting what we'd built. When I finally told him, I braced for disappointment, maybe even anger. Instead, he smiled, that same steady warmth shining through. "We'll figure it out," he said. Distance doesn't have to be a deal breaker. His confidence made me want to believe it, but part of me was still scared. The week before I left, we spent every free moment together. Late night talks, stolen kisses, promises whispered in the dark. On my last night in town, we sat on his couch, wrapped in a blanket, the city lights twinkling outside. "I'm going to miss you," I said, voice barely above a whisper. "I'm going to miss you too," Eli replied. But this isn't goodbye. It's just, see you later. We held each other close, knowing that whatever came next, we'd carried something real through the chaos and the quiet. And as I closed the door behind me the next morning, suitcase in hand, I realized that sometimes love isn't about perfect timing or grand gestures. It's about showing up, even when the future is uncertain, and trusting that the messy, beautiful story you started will find its way. The months I spent away felt longer than I expected, even though I kept busy with work and tried not to let the distance swallow everything we'd built. We texted and called as much as possible, but it wasn't the same as the little everyday moments. Sharing a meal, catching each other's eye across a crowded room, or just falling asleep with someone beside you. Still, the thread between us held tight, a quiet promise that neither time nor miles could break. When I finally came back, the familiar weight of the city wrapped around me. Its sounds, its smells, the way the light hit the buildings just right in the early evening. I was nervous and hopeful all at once. What if things had changed? What if the distance had made us strangers? I didn't have to wonder for long. Eli was waiting outside the airport when I stepped out. His grin wide and real, open arms ready to pull me in. The moment I saw him, all the doubts slipped away like they never existed. We didn't need words at first, just a long, quiet hug that said everything. After, we walked slowly through the parking lot, hands finding each other naturally, like they'd never been apart. "You're home," Eli said softly. "Yeah," I smiled. "I'm home." In the days that followed, we settled back into our rhythm, a little wiser, a little more certain. The distance had tested us, sure, but it had also shown us what mattered most: honesty, patience, and the courage to keep choosing each other, even when it wasn't easy. One night, sitting on Eli's couch with a worn photo album between us, I realized that the real magic wasn't in grand moments or perfect timing. It was in the messy, imperfect bits, the confetti-strewn streets after the parade, the awkward coffee dates, the late-night talks, and the fights we fought and made up for. Love wasn't a neat, tidy package. It was a collection of moments, a series of choices, a feeling that grew stronger because we showed up again and again. So here we are, two messy people who found each other in the chaos. And honestly, I wouldn't have it any other way.